Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 35 of our reading of Rod Serling's Twilight Zone, 26 Unforgettable Explorations into the Realm of the Supernatural, and it's adapted by Walter B. Gibson. We're going to go over the copyright information real quick, as we always do. Rod Serling's Twilight Zone is copyright 1963 by Cayuga Productions Incorporated, and Rod Serling's Twilight Zone Revisited is copyright 1964 by Cayuga Productions Incorporated, all rights reserved. This 1983 edition is published by Bonanza Books, distributed by Outlet Book Company, and is a Random House company. And the address is there if you want it. This book was previously published as two separate works entitled Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone and Rod Serling's Twilight Zone Revisited, printed and bound in the United States of America, and all the Library of Congress information is there. We have been reading from The Fiery Spell, and it is really fascinating. Apparently this convict took this magical talisman and he was discovered, so now they are fighting for their lives. The convicts are anyways, or everyone is fighting for their lives really. But anyways, let's continue where we left off. Okay. It looks like we're almost done with this one, and then we'll start the next story. Now Blimp hooked a burly forearm around Bob's neck, hauling him backwards and half choking him, while Bob grabbed frantically for something else to throw and finally found an object. Ozzy called a warning. "Look out, Blimp." He grabbed the coffee jar. "Don't let him conk you with it." "I'll take it from him and put in more. Just hang on, Blimp." Instead of taking a swing at Blimp, Bob made a wild throw at the flaming hand. Blimp grabbed Bob's wrist as he threw, and the rounded jar slid from Bob's fingers. Scaling high and striking the window more than halfway up, it was the wildest, most hopeless throw of all, but the jar smashed and shadowed its powdery contents down on the hand of glory. It produced a singular result. The blue flames quivered at the tips of the bony thumb and fingers. Their hue became purple, turned crimson, then faded, dwindling, and went out. With that last splutter, the room was plunged into total darkness. In the excitement, Bob wrenched free and dashed out the hall. "Hang on to him, Rick," Rick was shouting. "Hang on while I light the wicks. We've got to keep the hand burning." Rick Hendry was only partly right. He shouldn't have let the flames go out at all. Once extinguished, the hand of glory had lost its spell. As proof, shouts were coming from upstairs. Electric switches were being pressed. Lights were gleaming all over the house. The Randall household was up and on the go. Bob's father and his two brothers were coming to his rescue with loaded shotguns. When Ozzy and Mort saw them, they forgot Bob and raced out the side door, through which Rick and Blimp already had fled. As the routed burglars sprinted across the lawn, the chauffeur and the horse trainer appeared at the back door and fired shots after them. But by then, Rick Hendry and his crew had reached their car and were speeding out through the woods. They continued on down Laurel Hill and drove off wildly into the night, hoping only that the state police would not catch up with them. All the while, Rick Hendry kept snarling, "That crazy old fool Doc Folsom, telling me nothing would put out those flames except milk. So the guy throws a jar of instant coffee and it does the same job. Instant coffee is right. That's how fast it did it. I'd like to show old Doc a jar of coffee and let him see how it works. Only I wouldn't crack it over the hand of glory. I'd crack it over old Doc's head." Though Rick Hendry didn't know it, he was being unfair to Abner Folsom. That was proven back at the Randall Mansion when Lieutenant Tony Lambert of the state police was checking the scene of the crime that failed. Lambert was studying the odd trophy, a bony hand with wax wicks at the tips of the thumb and fingers. A crazy lot, crooks, declared Lambert. They come up with all sorts of superstitions. They probably thought that by lighting these things up, they would hypnotize everyone in the house. Actually, it was just coincidence that everyone stayed asleep. Bob Randall didn't agree, but he said nothing. Lieutenant Lambert turned to the state trooper who was taking notes. "Put this in the report," Lambert ordered. The hand remained upright on the window ledge until its flames were extinguished by the contents of a jar of instant coffee. One moment, Lieutenant, interrupted Pauline Randall, who was standing by the big buffet table. There was only one jar of instant coffee on the buffet, and it's still here. She turned to her brother and asked, Are you sure you threw the coffee jar? I thought I did, returned Bob. At least I was grabbing for it, but I might have just got a hold of something else instead. We'll settle that, decided Lieutenant Lambert. He went over to the window ledge, poked around, and found the top of the broken jar, and held it to the light, and read its printing, and said to Pauline, You're right, Miss Randall. That wasn't a coffee jar. The lieutenant turned to the state trooper and ordered, Cross out the last line of the report. I'll give you a correction. The trooper crossed out the lines. Very well, sir. How would you like it to read? The hand remained upright on the window ledge, the lieutenant dictated, until the flames were extinguished by the contents of a jar of powdered milk. Though they didn't know it, Lieutenant Lambert had solved the fantastic riddle of the fiery spell. Now, just checking to see how much time we have left. Okay. Now we have the story titled The Ghost of the Dixie Belle. Okay, this is a long one. That's good. When Silent John Morland stood behind the big wheel of the steamboat Dixie Belle and studied the broad expanse of the Mississippi stretching off into the distance, his eyes took on a faraway expression that marked him as one of the greatest pilots on the river. That indeed was a high distinction, for this was during the heyday of the steamboat era. Visitors in the pilot house often watched Silent John read the river, as they put it. The height of the water as a landing, floating tree branches or stranding logs indicated whether the water was higher or lower upstream, and told him whether he could run a chute or risk crossing a sandbar. Going downstream, he could always tell when or where the current was the best, or which course to take if it divided. All these things paid off for John Morland, as they did for other pilots. The difference was that he seldom talked about it, as the others did, which was why they called him Silent John. But the difference went deeper than that. Where other pilots had their ways and whims, Silent John was as solid as Old Man River himself. Solid and stolid. Okay. When other pilots were in the money, they dressed in gaudy suits with puffed shirt fronts, kid gloves, and high silk hats. When they had no berth, they would put on working clothes and make it look as though they were going to a job or coming from one. But Silent John always looked the same, with his long black coat, plain tie, and wingtip collar, and an old-style stovepipe hat. He wore the same garb in and out of the pilot house, except for the hat, which he laid aside when he took the wheel. As for expressing themselves, other pilots might hum hymns while navigating shoaled water where their boat might run aground. They were known to whisper fervent prayers while making headway against a raging flood that threatened to twist the boat around and crash it into the canebrake along the riverbank. And when a timber raft or trading scow drifted across their bow or beneath a paddle wheel, they would let loose with all the profanity available in the vocabulary of the day. Not so with Silent John. He either said nothing or spoke in language as pure as that of the religious tracts which well-meaning persons brought from New Orleans and St. Louis and handed out to loungers who watched the Dixie Belle dock at the river landings. Nothing, it seemed, could disturb a mind so dedicated to the river as that of Silent John Morland. There was one person who knew differently. That was Dave Shelby, the Cub pilot, the Cub pilot, who was learning the trade from John Morland. For 2 years, he had been in the pilot house with Silent John during nearly every watch on other river packets as well as the Dixie Belle. Never once had Dave known his chief to depart from his usual form, but there were times when Silent Jim let Dave Shelby take the wheel and gave him advice that no one else ever heard. Don't try to read the river just as you see it, Silent John instructed him. Keep thinking of what it will be like in another hour or two, or some 20 or 30 miles further along. The little things you see right away, floating logs and such, will slip into the corner of your mind and stay there, like part of the big picture. And suppose, asked Dave, the picture isn't what you expect when you get there. It always will be, returned Silent John. At least, most anyways. There are times, though, when your thoughts can get out of hand, I might say. Out of mind. Like when? Like when you begin regretting things, thinking of what you might have done or you done different, or what you should have done if you could do it over. I'll talk about that some other time. Some other time came a month or so later when the Dixie Belle was plowing her way through a current of absolute blackness beneath a clouded night sky, when Silent John, handling her as nonchalantly as if it were broad daylight. This piece of river is just as I expected, declared Silent Bob. I kind of daydreamed about it earlier, but sometimes those daydreams carry you off somewhere, like into the past or into the future, or maybe just somewhere else. You understand? Dave didn't understand, but he nodded, and that encouraged Silent John to continue. I was about your age when I came downriver with $500 to last me until I got a job. I took passage on the old Queen City, and I met a bunch of crooked gamblers who took me and my $500. I landed flat broke in New Orleans, and I was ashamed to write the folks in Indiana for their money. So I wrote that I was shipping in and out of New Orleans on trading schooners, hoping to get a mate's berth. Instead, I was working on the dock as a roustabout, hoping someday I'd make enough money to go home. And how long did that take you? Asked Dave. It was a couple of years, returned Silent John, before I could save enough to start learning the pilot trade, and a couple more before I was really on my own. But then it was too late. There was a girl up in Newbury. That's the name of my hometown. But she hadn't waited. She married someone else, so I never did go back, leastwise not in person. They had turned the invisible point, and Silent John was clanging the bell for more speed as he added, "On a black night like this, Dave, I sometimes see a light dead ahead. Then of a sudden, it will burst, and I'll find myself talking to folks in Newbury." Silent John broke off as a bright light spurted from the void, streaking across the steamboat's bow. The burst was a brilliance that etched the pilot house in every detail. "Thought maybe it was some craft up ahead," commented the pilot, "but it's just a shooting star, a regular fireball." Silent John was right. The sky was clearly beyond the point, revealing the twinkle of faint stars above the horizon. Evidently, this wasn't the kind of light that Silent John meant, but somehow the strange coincidence left Dave Shelby awed. The subject was dropped then, but a few weeks later, Silent John breached it anew. It was late afternoon, and heavy clouds were deepening the river with a purple twilight as the Dixie Belle turned a bend to the westward. Silent John was at the wheel when he confided in a hushed tone, "It was like this the afternoon my mother died. I'd had no word that she was ill, nothing to forewarn me, like now. It was after sundown, river time." Silent John clicked open the case of his big watch for Dave to see. When the sunlight came through the clouds and flooded this very pilot house, in the dimness, Dave saw a strained, faraway stare on the pilot's face as Silent John continued. Only it wasn't the pilot house any longer. It was our home in Newbury, and I could see my brother's face and I could see my mother's face and hear her voice calling, "John, John, are you here in time?" My sister Esther was there too, and my brother Hiram. Silent John turned his gaze towards Dave, and I saw them as plainly as I'm seeing you now. No, even more plainly because, as I said, everything was all bright and sharp like daylight. They were both saying, "Yes, John is here with us." Then, of a sudden, it was dark again. Timed almost to those words, there came a blaze of sunlight from amid the overhanging clouds. Dave blinked, half expecting to see the pilot house transformed into another place. Instead, the purple twilight returned, then deepened into sullen blackness as the Dixie Belle plodded on, but again, the strange coincidence of the returning sunlight seemed to verify John Moreland's story. Afterwards, Dave Shelby checked the exact hour and minute of the sunset with the river time used by the steamboats that plodded north and south along the Mississippi. He found out that Silent John was right. The sun actually had set before they had seen its burst from the cloud bank. Dave decided that it must have been a strange freak caused by the rain-laden atmosphere. But even allowing for that, the fact that it had happened just when Silent John mentioned it made the coincidence border on the uncanny. Again, on a night when a rising mist began to dim the moonlight that flicked the mighty river, Silent John reverted to his favorite theme when he and Dave were in the pilot house together. "A fog like this lifts me with it," John Moreland asserted. Next, I've drifted home and I'm telling Esther things I know she hears because she's my twin sister and we always knew what the other was thinking. Sometimes I get through to my brother Hiram, too. "Maybe you're wondering why I'm certain of this." Silent John looked warily at Dave to make sure he was interested. "So I'll tell you. Always there have been letters come confirming it. Hiram and Esther both wrote me after Mother died saying they knew I was there with them. Other times they've written answers to questions I asked them." Dave Shelby could well believe it, for the thickening fog had caught him in its grip too. Then, as the swirl lessened and the floating sensation ended, and they were thrumming along in the Dixie Belle, with the steady pound of the big paddles echoing behind them. Months passed, and the Dixie Belle was bound downriver on a trip that was all important to Dave Shelby, for he had served his time as an apprentice, and a pilot's license would be waiting for him when he reached New Orleans. They still had a 2-day run ahead when Silent John Moreland announced, "Dave, my boy, this is my last trip as a pilot on the Dixie Belle. I've arranged with Captain Hoskin for you to take over my berth." Dave Shelby blinked in disbelief. "You mean you're giving up the river, Chief?" "Not exactly," rejoined Silent John. "I'm going home, this time by water. I'm going to pilot an old stern wheeler, the Tecumseh, that runs up the Wabash River to Terre Haute and lays over their weekends, so I can go to Newbury and stay with my folks." There was no show of emotion in the veteran pilot's weather-beaten face, but Dave knew the sentiment that the words expressed. Right then, Dave Shelby felt happier for John Moreland than he did for himself. "A right nice packet, the Tecumseh," commented Silent John. "Her skipper won't allow gamblers on board any more than Captain Hoskin would tolerate them here on the Dixie Belle. I made sure of that before I took the pilot's job." Dave started to say something, then caught himself. He realized that Silent John was probing him with a keen, quick eye, so Dave hastily stammered his thanks for his new job and added congratulations. Next, he found an excuse to leave the pilot house and go below. Down below in the steamboat's ornate main saloon, Dave entered the smoking room, studied a group of card players at the corner table, and spoke hastily to the steward in charge. Down in the steamboat's ornate main saloon, Dave entered the smoking room, studied a group of card players at the corner table, and spoke hastily to the steward in charge. If there are any professional gamblers in that crowd, better get them out. Silent John is on the warpath. The steward blinked. But this is Moreland's watch, he reminded the young man. How can he leave the pilot house? He could put anyone on the wheel, returned Dave. We're going straight down a mile-wide channel, with no shoal or reef in the next 10 miles. I skipped out on purpose. But by now he could have called the engine room to send someone up. With a worried nod, the steward beckoned to one of the card players, a hard-faced man with a pointed mustache and goatee, who wore a plum-colored jacket and a gray velvet waistcoat with a huge gold chain across the front. The man laid his cards aside and came over to hear what the steward had to say. Mere mention of Silent John brought a disdainful smile to the gambler's lips as he strolled back to the group and told them, You'll have to excuse me until later, gentlemen. If you would like to play for some real high stakes this evening, you'll find me in the last cabin on the Texas deck. The name, just so you don't forget, it is Matt Kiley. I won't forget it. The sharp interruption came from the doorway of the smoking room. Kiley turned to see John Moreland standing there. For the first time in his long career, the veteran pilot was dropping his part of Silent John on this, his last trip. I remember you and other sharpers from a long way back, John Moreland said. From the first day I piloted a packet. I've done my best to clear such scum from the river. Maybe I've been getting careless in the past few months, not looking over the passengers as I should. So you've been working in a cabin on the Texas deck, so I would think it was just a friendly game among the crew in their own quarters. You won't be running any game tonight, Matt, because you'll no longer be on board the Dixie Belle. Silent John swung to Dave Shelby and added, We're stopping at Cedar Landing to pick up a passenger for New Orleans. That's where we will put this thief ashore. You won't put me ashore, Matt Kiley blustered. I'm a paying passenger. I'll take this up with Captain Hoskin. Do that, urged Silent John. Ask him which he'd rather keep on board, a crooked gambler or a reliable pilot. One of us is getting off at Cedar Landing. You or I, Matt. With that, Silent John went back to the pilot house, beckoning Dave Shelby along. There, Silent Bob relieved one of the mates who had been handling the wheel immediately. Dave became apologetic. Chief, I didn't know Matt Kiley was on board, he said. I've never even heard of him before. I'd only heard talk about the captain getting lax when gamblers were concerned, probably because this was your last trip. And you didn't want it spoiled for me, Silent John interposed in a kindly tone. I understand, Dave. He brought his big watch from his pocket. It's 7:20 now, and we're due at Cedar Landing in another 15 minutes. I want you to make sure Matt Kiley gets off there. Then have some coffee and a piece of pie, and be back up here at 8 o'clock. Understand? Dave nodded and was turning to go when Silent John said quietly, Wait. Then, pointing out the river, he traced a grayish, ghostly outline that was barely discernible in the fading sunlight off beyond it. He indicated the blurred shape of the rising moon. Fog gathering ahead, Silent John declared. We won't pull into that landing. I'll blow for them to bring out the yawl and make sure that Matt goes ashore in it. Dave went out and down past the Texas cabins, which were just below and behind the pilot house. The last door was ajar, and Dave could hear muttering, and it sounded like Matt as the gambler was packing his carpet bag. Dave continued down to the galley, where he decided to have his coffee and pie before he reached Cedar Landing. But he had hardly ordered them when he heard the clang of bells calling for the stoppage of the engines. Next, a whistle throated a huge blast, and the Dixie Belle drifted with the current. Dave stepped out to the stern of the boiler deck just as the bow of the yawl poked from the fog. A rower tossed the end of a rope up to the deckhands, who held it tight while the passengers came aboard. Captain Hoskins, who was standing by, expressed his admiration. We're going to have to stop it here. We'll find out what happens next time. We have been reading The Ghost of the Dixie Belle. And actually, we've been reading Rod Serling's Twilight Zone, 26 Unforgettable Explorations into the Realm of the Supernatural, adapted by Walter B. Gibson. If you like this content, make sure you like and subscribe, ring the bell so you know when I upload. Also, want to support me in any way, if you want to join the Discord server, all the information will be in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.